Okay, I have permission from Professor Lee to resume, to start the second lecture. The second lecture is on conceptual integration, which is an essential mapping scheme that we find in many, many human activities, but in particular for language. It's crucial for human language, both for grammar and for the construction of meaning, to have conceptual integration. The picture on the slide here is actually taken from a book for children, and it does several things. It is meant to illustrate, both in an accessible way, both for children and for adults, the process of evolution, but of course in a very compressed, very simplified form. So what you see here is the evolution of dinosaurs changing over long periods of time, over millions of years, until we finally have birds as a result of the biological evolution and natural selection process. Now, of course, if we look at the picture by itself, what we see literally are 5 different animals. The first 3 are dinosaurs, the 4th is in between, and the last one is a bird. Okay, we'll see how long this works. So if we look at the picture, we see the 4 different ones. But it's very natural for us to integrate them into a single animal, notice, that would be chasing a single dragonfly. There are, in fact, 5 dragonflies. But we can immediately perceive this, if we want, as a single dinosaur in a very short period of time chasing the dragonfly and changing as it tries to capture the dragonfly. And the pressure to be able to capture the dragonfly makes the dinosaur change until it becomes a bird, and then it gobbles up, it eats up the dragonfly. Okay? So this is an integration because we have, even at the superficial level here, we have 5 different pictures in one. And then in our minds, we form a single motion with a single animal, a single dinosaur bird chasing a single dragonfly. So let's look at, in some more detail, at how the integration process actually works. And before I do that, let me give you a little bit of background. A lot of this work is joint work with my colleague Mark Turner, and we started working on this a while back, actually in 1993, but we made several notable discoveries as we went along. And in particular, in 1999, 2000, we worked together at Stanford and eventually published this book, the book called The Way We Think. And in the Stanford work, we discovered compression phenomena that we had not discovered before. Before, we had focused on conceptual blending and integration, but in the year 2000, we started to notice the systematicity of compression phenomena. So what I'll be talking to you about are both blending on the one hand and compression on the other. You can access a lot of the literature through the website that I gave this morning, or even directly for blending, you can go directly to Blending Stanford EDU. You can also access through the first one. Now, on that website, you will find a lot of recent work, many, many books and articles, and so on. What's interesting, I think, from the cognitive linguistics point of view, is that out of this work on conceptual blending that started with preoccupations of language, out of this work emerged work in a lot of other areas. Again, corroborating, if you like, what I was trying to say this morning, that the mental, cognitive operations that we have are used not just for language and meaning in language, but also for constructing meaning in many other domains, like art, religion, and so forth. So if you look at this, this array of book, you have my pointer? I can't reach that high, but you see a number of books, and in particular, some of the books. This is a book on art. This is a book on magic and religion. This is a book on design. People doing design have found interesting ideas from conceptual blending theory. This is a book on religion again, and more generally culture, anthropology. This is a book on artificial intelligence and computational models of conceptual blending. And over here you have, up there you have the book by Rafael Nunez and George Lakoff on mathematics, where they explore the successive blends that create more and more and more mathematics. So it's extremely interesting to see the construction of mathematics through conceptual blending by mathematicians. This is a book by Scott Liddell on sign language. And sign language, as you know, is extremely interesting for linguists because it's the language often spoken by the deaf, and there are different sign languages, American Sign Language, Chinese Sign Language, and so on. And they reveal interesting structure because the sign languages, of course, operate in a gestural modality and not in a spoken oral modality. And so we can sort of tease apart the aspects of language that are entirely due to speech and phonetics, and the aspects of language that are deeper, that are due to the construction of meaning, what we're interested in this afternoon. Over here, 1, 2, 3, you see some special issues of journals, the Cognitive Linguistics Journal, the Language and Literature Journal, the Journal of Pragmatics Journal, and all of those issues are special issues all about conceptual blending. So again, you can find papers and articles that explore problems of literature or problems of pragmatics in terms of conceptual blending. So I put all that up to give you a sort of idea of the range of things. Now, you might say, well, I'm a linguist or I'm a teacher of language, and so, you know, why should I care about mathematics or about design or about religion? But in fact, we think, of course, in cognitive linguistics, that one of the things that makes cognitive linguistics the most exciting is precisely the fact that we find corroborating evidence and applications in the neighboring areas. Okay, so we can use one to explain the other and vice versa. And also, from a purely, for those of you who are teachers, from a purely pedagogical point of view, I believe it should be extremely useful to explain to your students some of these ideas and some of these notions using precisely domains outside of language so that they can see the correlation. These may be domains that they are familiar with or interested in independently. There's a book on music way up there, for example. So it's a nice combination, but it's also, if you like, it's a vindication of the early ideas when we started cognitive linguistics in the late 1970s with other colleagues like George Lakoff and Ron Langaker, who came here, or Len Talmy. One of the claims at the time was that because we had very general operations, we would find them in these other areas. And indeed, we did. And so, you know, a number of people were able to do a lot of work in other areas vindicating, in some sense, the idea that you don't want to separate language from other things. You want to study them together as far as meaning construction goes. And this is, of course, what I was alluding to this morning. Okay, so let me start with a very familiar example that some of you have already seen because it's in the books and I've talked in other lectures. In fact, in China, I've used this example just because it's a simple example to get the basic idea of conceptual blending. Here, I put on the screen the very general diagram of blending two mental spaces together. So this morning we talked about mental spaces, and here we take two mental spaces that are different, but that have some correspondence between them. And up here we have something called the generic space, which is what is common to the input spaces. And then we do projections, partial projections, into a novel blended space. And in that blended space, there will emerge novel structure, emergent structure. Okay? And that's the power of the integration. Now, on your handout, which starts on page 12 of the book, you'll find this diagram, but you'll find also, I don't know if I've got it here, you'll find another diagram with many mental spaces. Because typically, what happens is you don't blend two mental spaces, but you often have several. You have many together, and then they give you a blended space, which in turn can blend with other spaces. So the real networks, the ones that we manipulate unconsciously, remember, in everyday life, the real networks are typically much more complex than just two spaces. But I will illustrate the basic principles with two spaces. This more complex network is what you need to construct in order to understand something pretty simple, which is the stork bringing babies. You know, the legend of how do babies come into the world? Well, there's a stork that brings the babies into the world. Simple idea, but if you unravel that idea and find all the mental spaces that are connected in order to produce this single image, you find, in fact, you find many more than two. You find at least all of this and probably more. Okay, now, as you'll see, the principles behind creating novel blended spaces are the principles that you see here. You have to find a matching between at least two inputs. Then you have to find what they have in common. That's the generic space. And then you do blending by projecting selectively, projecting part of the inputs into a new mental space. And then you have the emergent structure, which is produced by composition. Composition is just putting things together. But also pattern completion. Pattern completion is having a part of a pattern and completing it to a larger pattern. So, for example, if you see for the first time, if you see this for the first time, most of you will probably, although you're only seeing, can I hold it here? Okay, although you're only seeing this and that, in your mind you will complete it and you will assume that there is a straight pointer. Of course, you don't really know. It could be a trick by a magician. There would only be a little pointer here, a little pointer here, and nothing behind. Or there could be a very crooked pointer, okay? But our minds do pattern completion all the time. We see somebody from behind going into the door, and we complete the pattern. We assume that it's this or that person. Let's say Thomas, because we've seen part of Thomas, we complete into one person that we happen to know. Of course, in order to do that, we have to have in our minds the templates, the patterns, the complete patterns that we can complete in this way. So because we have a pattern of a straight line, it's easy when we see two parts of the straight line, it's easy to complete it into a single straight line. I use this, again, stock example, familiar example, with apologies to those who've already seen it. This is to sort of illustrate the notion. This is a little article taken from a sailing magazine, and the situation is this. It's happening in 1993. There is a catamaran, you know, a boat, a sailboat with two hulls, and the catamaran is going around the Cape Horn in South America, sailing from San Francisco all the way to Boston. And it's trying to go fast. But it's also trying to go faster than a clipper, a ship, back over a century before. In 1853, the ship sailed in 76 days from San Francisco to Boston. So this catamaran is sailing by itself, but it would like to, you know, be faster to break the record of the early ship that was a century and a half before. And so when you look at the way this is described in the magazine, you see the two sailors on the catamaran, Rich Wilson and Bill Biwenga, and they were barely maintaining a 4.5-day lead over the ghost of the clipper Northern Light. So it is described as if the clipper was actually sailing at the same time as they are sailing and was behind them by 4.5 days distance. Of course, in reality, the clipper sailed many, many years before. This construction, using the word ghost, is a typical blend. And what's happening is an example of the general schema of integrating mental spaces. So the two input mental spaces are the one with the clipper, with the old ship in 1853 sailing around Cape Horn, and the other input mental space is the present-day catamaran doing the same course, sailing on the same course. Those are the two input spaces. We can match them easily because they share a lot in common. They have the same course. They have boats in each one, not the same boat, but two boats, two sailboats. We have skippers and captains. We have sailors and sailors. So there's a lot of things that we can match that correspond. And here's how you do the matching. You take the two input spaces and you match the parts of the spaces. So the journey, as you can see, is the same, the San Francisco to Boston up here. And then you can match the nth day, like the 20th day of the journey, you can map it with the 20th day of the other journey. And over here, the year 1853 corresponds to the year 1993, and so on. Many things correspond, many things match. Now, they match because there is a generic space which represents what these two inputs have in common. And the generic space is simply here the more abstract frame of, inside a mental space, of course, the more abstract frame of any sailboat sailing from San Francisco to Boston on some day, in some year, and being in some position. Okay? So we project from the inputs. So this is the input that has NL means Northern Light. That's the name of the clipper. And this is the other input that has GA is Great American. That's the name of the catamaran. And we project both of those into the novel blended space so that now, on any given day, we project the position, the corresponding position of the boat in the input, days on the journey. Like 20th day in the journey, what was the position of Northern Light, what was the position of Great American. You can see this has the same mental space structure that we studied this morning. There are input spaces, and then the element up here, NL, has a counterpart in the blended space, NL prime, just like the ones we had this morning, A prime, A double prime, and so on. Now, in the blended space, by composition, you've got the two boats together. Of course, this is an act of imagination. It's not reality. And in the imagination, then the two boats are together. So this is the blended space. Here's the journey. And, you know, at some point, on some day of the journey, in some year, 1993, the blended space takes on the date 1993 from one input. It takes the clipper from the other input. Okay? It doesn't take everything. For example, it could not take the year 1853 because then that would contradict the year 1993. So it picks some things and leaves others out. Okay, we end up with this kind of configuration. There's the generic space up here, the two inputs here, and then the blended space that you are creating. Now, the blended space is created by producing its own emergent structure. How does it do that? Well, first, of course, composition. It has two boats instead of one. Each of the inputs had only one boat. The blended space has two boats. But in addition to that, we have pattern completion that I was talking about. When you have two boats on the same course, it's very easy to complete that pattern into a race between boats and to say, oh, those boats must be competing. They must be racing. They're on the same course. So pattern completion creates additional structure, the structure of a race between the boats, which, of course, could not be in the inputs, where there was only one boat. Then we do the third part of producing emergent structure, and that's elaboration, that we call running the blend. The blend is a dynamic thing. It's not just the circles that you see on the screen. It's a dynamic, in-motion scene, if you like. And in that scene, you have the boats racing so that you can compare their positions. And in particular, you can have one skipper of the catamaran boat looking back and saying, ooh, are we still ahead of Great American, of the catamaran, okay? Of the clipper, Northern Light, it's called. So you have, in the magazine article, when it says maintaining the lead over the ghost, you've introduced this ghost of a ship so that the people on the boat, Great American, the catamaran, can be aware now of the clipper. But the clipper, of course, cannot be aware of them because in the original input, they had no knowledge that one day, much later, there would be a catamaran that would come and try to break the record. So this explains then why we get in the actual text, in the language, it explains why we get this particular formulation. Okay, they were barely maintaining a 4.5-day lead over the ghost of the clipper. That describes not the inputs, but it describes the blended space. It allows the reader of the article can look at that, and because, again, we have these unconscious blending capacities, we read that and we automatically decompress. And so we go to the inputs, we go from the blended space to the inputs, and we can therefore compare the two positions of the boats in the different inputs, which actually have been described to us in the single blended space input. Okay, here's another very classical example of blending. This is the so-called debate with Kant blending. And it has to do with cases where you have a professor like me. So imagine, instead of me, a philosophy professor. And the philosophy professor is by himself, and he's explaining something to you. And he explains it in this way. He says, I claim that reason is a self-developing capacity. Kant disagrees with me on this point. Kant says blah, blah, blah. Kant says this. Kant says that. Now, notice the description is, of course, completely false. Kant cannot be here in the room arguing with me. Kant has been dead for many, many years. So what's happening, just like with the boats, is that a conceptual blend is created. You bring Kant from one input, and you bring the present-day situation. The philosophy professor, you bring from the other input. Now, this has a lot of stuff in it, but all you need to remember is there is one common frame. The common frame is the frame of a thinker who expresses ideas in some language, okay, a philosophy thinker, for example. That's the generic space up there. And then you have two inputs that are special cases of that. One is Kant in the late 18th century, 1780 something, maybe. And over here you have the philosophy professor who is speaking. Okay? And now you project and you bring them into a blended space. In that blended space, you've got two people talking. Since they're talking about the same thing, pattern completion will say, oh, those two people are probably having a conversation, or even an argument, because they're philosophy academics who like to argue. So pattern completion will take what you have here in the two inputs, the two people talking, Kant and the philosophy professor, and will complete that into the debate frame, the argument frame, okay, where there's an argument going on. And then you will run the blend. And what's happening in the text, in this piece of text, is the speaker is running the blend. He's saying, well, here's how the argument goes. Here's the debate. And of course, he's bringing some of what he says here. He's bringing from his own ideas. And other things he's bringing from what he read in Kant, that Kant maybe wrote, a long, long time ago. Of course, Kant wrote in German, and the philosophy professor is speaking, let's say, in English today or in Chinese and so on. But it doesn't matter. In the blended space, they have the same language, English in this case, and they are together and they're disagreeing. And notice the philosophy professor wins the argument against Kant. He says, I say this, and Kant has no answer. So in this case, the advantage of constructing a blend is a rhetorical advantage, because in your blended space, you argue against somebody, a philosopher who's very prestigious, and yet you win the argument against that philosopher. So your ideas must be very powerful. Okay? Are you with me on that? Of course, in reality, Kant cannot answer, really. He is dead, so he can't rebut the philosophy professor. But in the blended space, the philosophy professor is free to take from the Kant input whatever he wants, and then to have his own ideas and to present this as a debate. This is a very frequent, this is almost a conventional way of presenting certain ideas, to evoke people from the past and talk about them as if they were right here in the room with you and you were having a debate with them. Okay? But to do that, you have to have a conceptual blend. And again, if you think of comparison with other species, with, again, even very intelligent primates, you can see how it's going to be very, very unlikely that even intelligent primates could build this kind of very elaborate construction that relies on memory, projection, many mappings, and so on. Okay, so more examples. I want to give you a certain number of examples here, because if you come to future lectures, it will be useful to really know how conceptual blending works, because I'll be using it pretty often. Okay? So this afternoon, I'm making a special effort to make sure that we're on the same wavelength, that we understand this idea of conceptual blending in the same way. And in the question period, you'll have many opportunities to clarify this even more. Now, this is another example that is partly linguistic and partly visual. It's an advertisement. It's a commercial advertisement. And on the advertisement, you see 3 little children. They're very cute. It's Joey, Katie, and Todd. Very cute children. On your handout, you can read the text that corresponds to you have the text that is below the picture in the ad here. And then you have an operating table. This is a hospital, and there's somebody on this operating table who's being operated. And guess who it is? It's you. You, the person looking at the picture. They will be performing your bypass. What does that mean? It seems incoherent at first, okay? Little children do not perform operations. You are in good health. There's no reason you should need a bypass. And if you need a bypass, you're not going to have little children perform it. So why this ad? Well, this ad was an ad for education, saying that in America, education was very poor, not good enough, and that we need more money, to make education better. And so the ad is soliciting donations. It's saying, pick up your telephone and give money to the cause of education. And the idea here is, if you don't do that, if you leave education as bad as it is, then the children with the bad education today will become bad professionals 20 years from now. So, for example, they'll become bad doctors. And then in 20 years, you are the one who will need a bypass. You'll need the operation. And you'll have these doctors who are incompetent. Now, of course, the doctors in 20 years won't be children. They'll be adults like you and me. So you can see how this is a blend of the children today with a bad education, but very cute, and the adults that they will become tomorrow, the bad doctors who will be performing your operation. The power of this blend is that when you see the blend, instead of saying, oh, it's going to happen in the future in 20 years, and of course, who knows what happens in 20 years, suddenly the blend makes the urgency of the situation immediate. You see yourself on the operating table, and you understand that the children are incompetent because children don't know how to operate. So it's a powerful ad in that sense. And the way that it is constructed by the reader who reads the ad, but also, of course, by the people who devise the ad, the way it's constructed is, let's do it first with the circles. Again, you have this diagram on your handout on page 16 of the book, so page 5 of the current handout. And what you see when you decompress this is the blended space with the children doing your operation. And over here, you have the 2 inputs. One input is the children with the bad education, and the other input is later, 20 years later, they become doctors and they're incompetent and they don't know how to operate you. So on this slide, you can see the correspondence between the 2 inputs. Poor education for the child corresponds to low competence later, 20 years later, when they become doctors, for example. And the child, of course, changes into an adult doctor. So there's an identity connection, as we saw this morning, but no similarity. The child is very different from the adult. And then we have a change and physical space relations. The year I put here, 2004, when the ad was published. You look at the ad, 2004, and then, of course, later, when you have the operation, it's going to be 2024. So all of this is compressed into the blended space, and when you process the blended space, notice you do this very fast. Again, humans don't have to think about this. They don't have to say, ooh, where's the input, where's the projection, and so on. We understand the ad instantly. We're leafing through the magazine, and probably in 10 seconds we can understand the point. Okay? And why? Because we're automatically doing the decompression of the blended space into the inputs, the generic, and so on. So this is, in a diagram mode, this is what you end up with. An input with children, another input with the same children who have become adult doctors, and then the blended space where you have children doctors botching up your operation, not succeeding in operating you, even though they're cute. And so you die. That's the consequence in the blended space, okay, which is supposed to make you pick up your telephone and pledge money, okay, give money for education. Here's another interesting example. This was published in the newspaper, the New York Times, in 1999, when El Guirouge, who's a runner, these are runners, okay, they're specialists of running the mile race, and El Guirouge had just broken the record, the world record of the mile. And so the newspaper published this picture where they put on the same track, they put El Guirouge reaching the finish line, but then they put all the previous champions. So the champion from Cram from 1985, and the champion Co from 1979, and so on, all the way back to Roger Bannister over here. Okay. So now, again, what happens is you have a number of inputs, which are all the races in which these 6 runners, these 6 phenomenal champions, they won the race and they broke the world record. So this is 6 input spaces now, okay? In each one of their races, they were phenomenal. When Roger Bannister over here, when he broke the record, and I was already alive then, not like most of you, and this was 1954, and he was the first person on Earth to run under 4 minutes, okay, for that distance, for the mile. So this was considered a phenomenal achievement. And then, of course, other runners did better in the years that follow, so the record was broken. But now, in the blended space here, you put them all on the same track. You leave out all the other runners that they beat in the inputs. They were, of course, the winners, and other runners were behind. Here, you leave behind the other runners. You just put them on the track, so that now, by pattern completion, again, we look at the track, we see all the runners on the track, and we say, oh, they're racing against each other. So we have Bannister and Cram and El Guirouge, and all in the same race, okay? Like the boats a little bit. And of course, in that race, which is unreal, in that race, which is a blended space, you can see El Guirouge over here beating everybody. And poor Bannister is left way, way, way behind, okay? So again, the power of the blended space here is that something that if you just described it and you said, oh, well, this guy ran in 3 minutes 55 seconds and this other one ran in 3 minutes 59 seconds, there would be a long list of figures. Here, in the blended space, it's compressed into a human scale dynamic scene that we can apprehend directly. And again, that's because humans are, if you like, on the one hand, they're good at blending and compression, but they also like to have things compressed into a human scale scene. The dinosaur, that one single motion to catch the bird. And here, one single race even though these people, of course, could not have raced against each other because there was a big difference in time. So for the reader, this brings immediately, in a very vivid way, the realization that Ailge Rouge is much better than the other champions, okay? Because we see this mythic race that is the result of a blend. Again, you need the human capacity of conceptual blending here in order to understand that. Even if you had an organism that could read the picture, the literal meaning would come in, and you would understand that as well. You know, there are 5 runners on there are 6. How many? 6 runners on the track. And so what? So to understand it, you have to take this and you have to decompress it into all the different inputs, the 6 races, and understand that in each race, each one of these guys was actually the winner and a big hero. But in the blended space, they're not heroes. They've all been beaten by Ailge Rouge. Okay, now this morning we saw a few examples of counterfactuals, mental spaces where you build up something that is contrary to reality. For example, this morning we had the AAA example. If you had had AAA, you know, then you could have gone to a phone and found some help. Conceptual blending allows you to build very, very diverse counterfactual spaces. Counterfactual spaces that are in fact very different from the ones the logicians considered with possible worlds. There was a good question this morning about possible worlds and whether, you know, mental spaces were like possible worlds. And in looking at this kind of counterfactual, you will see that the counterfactuals are not possible worlds at all, and yet we have no trouble understanding them and processing them. Why? Because we can decompress them. So here is the example that you have on the screen and also on the handout on page 6, that is 17 of the handout. And the background for understanding this piece of language, here's the piece of language. If they were still alive, they would also plead for mercy for their grandson. This is the story of a teenager who killed his grandparents. He murdered his grandparents, okay? And he has been found guilty by the tribunal. And now he is being sentenced. He's going to get a sentence of so many years in jail or worse. And the father of the boy is pleading with the judge and saying, please, please, judge, you know, don't give him a harsh sentence. Don't give him too harsh a sentence. And in order to make his plea, he says, in fact, the grandparents, if they were alive today, they loved their grandson very much. And if they were alive today, they would plead. They would also plead for mercy for their grandson. Okay? So you can see this is not a possible world because the grandparents, either they're alive and then there's no murder and there's no sentence, right? Or they're dead, murdered by the grandson, and in that case, they cannot be pleading mercy for him, right? But in the blended space, no problem. In the blended space, you can bring in the grandparents from one input, and you can bring in the murder from the other input. So here are schematically the 2 inputs. In one input, you have G is the grandparents here, and S is the son, okay, the teenage boy who killed the grandparents. So in that input, you have the dead grandparents and the son who murdered the grandparents. In this input over here, this is a counterfactual input. This is an input where there was no murder, and the grandparents are, you know, still alive, and they love their son, their grandson. Okay? In the blended space now, you use this counterfactual. You say, if they were still alive, but you bring in everything else that happened from the other input. So you bring in the fact that they were murdered and the fact that, of course, the teenage boy is about to be sentenced. This was called, the reason it's called the Zoloft murder case, by the way, is because the attorney the defense attorney for the boy pleaded that the reason he murdered his grandparents was because he was under the influence of the drug Zoloft. Zoloft is an antidepressant, okay? And so it was called the Zoloft murder. So now we see in the blended space, the grandparents are alive and they love their grandson, but at the same time, they're also murdered. And we have an emergent structure where they are victims of the crime and yet willing to plead for mercy. Now, the victim, in a way, has the most influence. The victim, for any given crime, the victim is supposed to be the most angry. The victim would be the one who would demand the harshest punishment for the criminal. So you bring in the grandparents. They are now at the top of the scale of they are a victim and therefore they would demand the harshest sentence. And yet you run the blend, and in the blend the grandparents plead for mercy. So the victim demands mercy, which means that anybody else on the scale should, of course, also demand mercy, not be harsher than the victim themselves. Okay? So you can see, again, the rhetorical power of the blended space. In the blended space, the grandparents appear, they defend the grandson, and their opinion is extremely important because they are the victims. Okay? But at the same time, of course, the blended space is impossible in reality because the grandparents are, in fact, not alive. This is not an exceptional case at all. We construct this kind of counterfactual blend all the time. Here's an example from cases where abortion is discussed. And it's about, a particular individual. And it says here, there was no freedom of choice for him as to whether he should be aborted or allowed to live. Had there been, he would not have chosen to be aborted. So you build a blended space in which, even though at the time that the abortion might take place, you have a small embryo or even a few cells or a small fetus, and you combine that with another input where the child exists many years later. And then in the blended space, the child can decide whether to be aborted or not. Again, as in the previous case, you can see that this is, of course, an impossible scene, and yet we find it very persuasive. We say, this individual would certainly not have chosen to be aborted, therefore this is against abortion. You can use similar counterfactuals, of course, to militate in favor of abortion. So it's not a matter of what side of the argument you're on. It's a matter of what kind of blends you can construct. My colleague Shanna Coulson has studied the rhetoric of abortion in looking in detail at actual pieces of exchanges on the radio, pieces of text, and so on. And regardless of whether people are arguing for abortion or against abortion, they use the similar techniques. They use a lot of conceptual blending in order to make things more vivid. This is another a case I'm going to show you where you, again, create a counterfactual that's very bizarre, but in fact simply wants to point to a disanalogy. So here's the sentence. In France, Monica Gate would not have done Clinton any harm. Monica Gate refers to, the whole scandal with President Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, and so on. And so at the time, in the United States, there was a lot of political action, including the impeachment of President Clinton, who was actually impeached by the House of Representatives, but not thrown out because the Senate saved him. So this kind of sentence is saying that what it means to say is, oh, the French system and the American system are similar. They have a president, they have voters and everything, but the impact of a sex scandal would not be the same in one country and in the other country. That's the intent of this particular sentence. Well, how is that constructed? If we take it literally, it's meaningless, because literally, of course, if Clinton had been in France, he would not have been president of the US, and he would not have been president of France because he's American and he couldn't be president of France. And if Monica Gate was happening to some other American president and Clinton was in France, then of course it would not do him any harm. And so all that is beside the point. That's not the point of this particular sentence, right? The point of this particular sentence is actually, and again, I'm sorry, the diagram is a little compressed, but I'll give you a quick idea of what it's trying to say. In one input, you have the US political system. In the other input, you have the French political system. Lots of correspondence between the two. The generic space is the frame of a political system with a president and with people in the country and with possible scandals and so on. And now, in order to construct the actual sentence, in France, Monica Gate would not have done Clinton any harm. In order to construct that, you project from one input, you project aspects of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So you project Clinton, and you project Monica Lewinsky, and you project, the American people, and so on. Okay? They all get projected in here. But from the other input, you project France, and you project the French mentality and the French kind of scandal. And so what you end up with is a blend of the two. This is now happening in France, but the president is very much like Clinton, and he did things like Clinton, and there was maybe a woman like Monica, and so on and on and on, right? And then you run the blend, you do the elaboration now of the blend, and what happens is, in this French Monica Gate, nobody cares. Nobody cares about the sex life of the president, and so there's no consequence. I'm not saying that would be true, by the way. I don't know what would happen in France in this particular case, but someone who says that sentence says, well, the Americans are more concerned about the sex life of their politicians than, let's say, the people in France. Not totally true, but maybe a little bit true. Okay. Now, there are grammatical elements and morphemes inside languages. And again, they're different from one language to the other. And they build up some of these counterfactuals automatically, so that you don't even think about it, but you're actually building a counterfactual. So here's an example, very simple example, of a linguistic way of making something out of nothing. The circles here are, they're mental spaces, but they're also tables. Okay, so you have, think of the circle as a table, and there are chairs around the table. Now, if you think of a typical situation, you have a table, and you have all the chairs around the table. Now, you look at the particular table that you're interested in, the table in your dining room, and you say something like, put some flowers in front of the missing chair. Why? Because around that table you have 5 chairs and nothing up at the top. There is no chair up at the top, okay? So you're describing the position that's up there, you're describing it as the missing chair. How can you do that? How can you call a chair something that is actually nothing? The reason, again, is a very systematic way for language to build in the notion of zero, actually, that was discovered in mathematics much, much, much later. And here's how it works. You take the real situation, like the chair, the table here with some chairs around the table. And then you have a normative in your mind. You have a normative frame that is shared culturally. For example, the frame of a table with the chairs disposed at regular intervals around the table. Now, that input is counterfactual, because that's not how your table is. The table in your dining room is like this and not like that, okay? But this is the standard frame for a table and chairs. So you take both of them as input, and again, you can put them into correspondence. You can do the matching of the tables, including the matching of the chair in the normative input and the position with nothing in the other input. And you bring that into a novel space, the blended space. You have all the actual chairs are projected from here. From here, you have the fact that there is nothing, but from the normative input, you have the idea that there should be a chair there. And that's why it gets called a chair. And the word missing serves explicitly to indicate this. Notice that there are two readings for this particular sentence, the missing chair, put flowers in front of the missing chair. It could be that you really have a chair that goes there, and that chair is in your, in your cupboard, in your closet or something, okay? Or it could be that you never had a chair there, but you would still call it a missing chair because of the normative comparison with the standard table with chairs all around it. So all these words in language, words like nothing, absence, nobody, missing chair, notice that they're all noun phrases. They all function as if they were something, because the language does the integration, and it's able to manipulate the absence as if it were something. So I can talk to, I can look over here in the room, and I can say, here are all the missing students, okay? And I can say, well, you missing students, you must come tomorrow, okay? I can say that looking at the chairs. Of course, they won't hear me, but you will hear me. I could also, if this was a regular classroom and I know who's sitting there, then I know that Bob should be in that chair and Mary in the other chair. And I can say, the absent students, Bob and Mary over there, I can point to them and I can say they will, have some kind of punishment for missing class. Okay. And the notion of zero in mathematics is the same. You have numbers, 1, 2, 3, and it took very long for the idea of creating an additional number, 0, that would represent absence. Now, language, furthermore, has interesting systematic ways of producing absence. So here, just by putting two nouns together, you create a blend that entails, that means that something is not there. A caffeine headache can mean you have a strong headache. It can mean that because you had caffeine, because you drank too much coffee. That's a possible reading. But it can also mean, for somebody who's used to drinking, drinks coffee all the time, and suddenly you deprive the person of coffee. They have no coffee, and that creates a headache. And they say, ooh, I have a caffeine headache, right? So a caffeine headache can be a headache because of absence of caffeine. And in the same way, a money problem is usually not a problem of having too much money. Okay? it's a problem of having no money. And a nicotine fit is a fit because you don't have your smoke, and so on, okay? A food emergency is an emergency because there is no food. So we can very systematically, with a very simple grammatical construction like that, we can create this kind of blend, the one I showed you with the missing chair. Namely, let's see if I have it here on the slide. Yes, here it is. So one input, for example, with the caffeine headache, in one input, you have the caffeine is producing the effect of feeling good and being full of energy and so on. In the other input, over here, it's like the chair. You didn't have, this is the real input, you didn't have the coffee. So there is nothing here, but there is a headache. So what's the cause of the headache? It's not something concrete because you didn't drink something that gave you a headache. It's actually, of course, the reason you have the headache is because normally you have coffee and this time you had nothing. So in the blend here, we put the two together, the normal situation, which didn't happen this time, which is counterfactual but normal, and the actual situation, we bring them together and we find that the headache actually has a cause, absence of caffeine. And the grammatical way of doing that is to call it a caffeine headache by putting the two together. Okay? These are things, you can see they're easy, but actually conceptually they're very complex because when you put two things together, usually you expect to have some combination of the two. So you expect, caffeine headache to be, well, caffeine produced the headache. But in fact, as in this case, or money problem, it's the absence that produced it. And the only way we can think of absence as a real thing, as a real cause, is because we can do the conceptual blending, making nothing into something. Okay, now page 718 of your handout, we go on to metaphor. And if you've studied metaphor in cognitive linguistics, I'm sure you know that the initial description of metaphor was that you have projection from a source to a target domain. So, for example, if you say, love is a journey as a metaphor, and you say that they were on the same path together, and suddenly they found themselves on the rocks, hitting the rocks. The journey has a sad ending. And from the source domain of the metaphor, you have this idea of a real journey, a vehicle, a boat or something, people traveling together who are in love. And then that projects to the more abstract notion of love. And if, for example, if the vehicle is damaged, or if the people leave the vehicle, for example, if they go out of the marriage, you can say, then it projects to the abstract idea that they're not in love anymore. So the fundamental view of metaphor was that you have a source domain that's usually pretty concrete, like a journey, and then you have a more abstract target domain, like love or anger, something that's harder to, or time that's harder to put your finger on. But when we look more, again, in terms of these notions of mappings and integration, we find that actually things are more complex. That metaphors are usually, again, conceptual blends. So they have more than just the source and the target. They also include a novel blended space with emergent structure. So let me show you a couple of examples of that, and we'll be close to the end. This is the example of digging your own grave. And you know that expression, you dig your own grave, means you're making a lot of mistakes. You're not aware of these mistakes. But in fact, if you keep on acting the way you do, making all these mistakes, you will fail or you will die. Okay? So it looks like there is a source domain of digging graves and dying, and then there's a target domain of making mistakes and failing. And that's partly true. But if we look at the actual inference structure, we see that there is not a transfer of the structure from the source to the target, because the causal structure and the frame structure and intentional structure are not the same. Why? Because in the domain of digging graves, what happens is first you die, and then somebody else digs the grave and puts you in the grave. The grave is not causing your death. It's your death that's causing somebody to dig the grave. Okay? And you're not aware of, if you're dead, you're not aware, you're not doing anything, you're not digging anything. And the person who is digging the grave is very much aware of digging the grave. So that person is not, unaware of what they're doing. So in fact, also the order of events is different. And the intentional structure, being aware or not being aware, is different. So in fact, they don't map onto each other. But if you think of it in terms of conceptual blending, then you can see that what's really happening is that you have part of the structure from digging graves is being projected into the blended space, but the intentional and causal structure and frame structure are being projected from the other input. So in the blended space, you end up with actually a very strange world, a world where you can dig graves without being aware. If you dig your grave very deeply, you fall into the grave and you die. Okay? If you think about it, that's a strange world. But we build it with the blended space by, again, projecting from both inputs. And the metaphor is totally easy to understand. Nobody says, hey, that's illogical, that's not how you dig graves. Okay? Why? Because, again, it's happening in the blended space. Another example with Clinton, the same, Monica Lewinsky scandal, people said sometimes, because Clinton was actually getting more popular, even though there was this big scandal, everybody liked Clinton. And so people said, if Clinton were the Titanic, the iceberg would sink. And what they meant by that, of course, was that Clinton was so strong that if you imagine Clinton Titanic, then even the iceberg would sink. Okay? He can overcome anything. Well, again, this is a metaphor because it's a metaphor based on the Titanic and the iceberg. But of course, it's not projecting the structure of the Titanic and the iceberg. It's building a novel structure, a structure where the iceberg sinks, contrary to the laws of physics even. And so what's happening is you build a blended space. You project the Titanic and the iceberg from this input over here. You project that into the blend. But the actual events, who is stronger, you project from the other inputs. So you end up in the blend with a Titanic that goes into the iceberg and sinks the iceberg. Again, very important to see that even though it's a metaphor, it's not using the inferential structure of the metaphorical source in order to produce meaning. It's actually using inferences from the other input to produce meaning, but it's using the frame structure, the human scale Titanic iceberg, two objects, in order to produce meaning. Okay. This brings us back to the dinosaurs that I talked about at the beginning and the fact that there's a lot of compression going on. And I will save that for tomorrow, the compression of the dinosaurs. What I will emphasize on that score is that you have very systematic compression. Some relations get compressed into others in a systematic fashion. And furthermore, that language does that also routinely. So we don't pay attention, but language has built-in mechanisms for doing these compressions. So if you say, my tax bill, let's say my tax bill gets longer every year or gets bigger every year, I don't mean that there is a single piece of paper that magically stretches, okay, year after year. What I mean is that I have several tax bills, and every year there is one, the one every year is bigger than the one before. Those tax bills are analogous, like the dinosaurs before, and they compress into a single tax bill that changes. So it's exactly like the dinosaurs. Many, many dinosaurs over evolution, we compress over a single changing dinosaur. And in this case, we compress all the many tax bills that I get into a single tax bill that changes through time. And language does this routinely. That is, we learn that as children, and we don't even think twice about it. So that's the important message that tomorrow I will elaborate greatly by talking to you about tomorrow morning about causal compressions and the way that we have huge causal compressions that we're not even aware of at all, and that language gives us a few little clues to do these compressions. Here are just a couple more examples of compression and blending. This is a book for children also, and it's called Harold and the Purple Crayon. And when the children see the book, Harold, the hero of the book, the character in the book, can draw in the book. But the important thing is he can draw whatever he wants to do. So, for example, he wants to go for a walk, he draws a path, and then he starts to walk on that path in the book, okay? So, here he is walking on the path that he draws himself. So there's a compression between the representation on the one hand and reality on the other, and they get compressed. And in the book, 2-year-old, 3-year-old children can read that, and they have a lot of fun reading it. In other words, children, very young children, are able to do these compressions. And here's an example from art. This is Magritte, and you can see it's called The Attempt of the Impossible. And this morning, I was using examples of models and painters, and this is the case where the model and the representation have been compressed together. So the artist is simultaneously creating the model and creating the painting. Okay? Very acrobatic to do mentally, but completely impossible, of course, to do in terms of painting and art. Okay, so thank you. I'll stop here, and again have some questions if you're still still awake.